Okay, welcome everybody to our today's podcast that comes from our COVID-19 Community Impact Survey. My name's Peter Giuliano. I'm accompanied by Scott Callender, and we're going to be hosting this webinar. I'll introduce you to our panel in a few minutes. This is a webinar series that was inspired by a survey that we did assessing the impact on a COVID-19 crisis on especially coffee businesses, and that gave us some key insights that we've built a webinar series around. So today's key insight is the importance of business communications, and joining us to help us understand this topic better are Israel Cerna. Wave, Israel, so everybody can see who you are. Israel is a partner marketing director for Annex Cloud, and he's got a long background of working for over a decade with small businesses, supporting small businesses, both generally and in the specialty coffee space. So we're really glad to have Israel here, and he's an expert in digital marketing and communications. Also joining us is Dr. Spencer Ross. He's assistant professor at University of Massachusetts at Lowell and Manning School of Business, their Manning School of Business. And he's done research in the specialty coffee space, as well as being an academic studying business marketing and business communications as well. So welcome to our panelists.
Thank you.
We're gonna start to explore the topic a little bit, but I wanted to talk about how we got here in the first place. So Leanne, if you could advance the slide. One key learning that we got when we did that survey is we noticed that people that were responding to our survey who emphasized the term communication or the practice of communication as a strategy for managing their business in the face of COVID-19, those respondents reported a much more optimistic opinion of their chances of surviving and thriving as a business during the crisis and then in the wake of the crisis. So this was actually one of the most striking elements of the respondents, how often the optimistic ones talked about communication. And let me share a few of those quotes with you here. If we could advance the slide, you'll see some of the words of the respondents. So, for example, respondent number 26 talked about communication being key, both internal and external. Respondent number 309 talked about communication and honesty, calling on community and loyal regulars, transparency with staff, reduced hours, the sites being open, leaving doors open to, these practices around safety. Respondent 356 talked about transparency, communication, lots of cleaning, helping customers feel safe. A couple more here on the next slide. Talking about regularly communicating with customers to ensure that the business is catering to their needs as things change, communicating enhanced measures, communicating the preparedness. So communication, communication, communication. So with this in mind, we wanted to reach out to these experts and get their thoughts about what these communications could look like and perhaps some best practices. So that's kind of where we started.
Yeah. Thanks, Peter. One thing I just wanted to, I think, start us with too. There's a lot of times I work in marketing, and when you work in marketing or you work in advertising or communications or PR, I think all of those things blur together for a lot of people. And seeing kind of the backgrounds of our two guests, they have marketing backgrounds, and we're talking about communications. And one thing I always love to do, even within my own company, is try and explain when we're using these words, what we're really talking about and the differences with like functions and how we're using those within our daily lives. So the first question I just had for our panelists before we dive into some slides and some presentation is, can you talk a little bit about the difference in your mind between marketing and communications?
Yeah, so one of the things that usually when I teach, so I teach, as a professor, I've taught marketing principles in a number of marketing courses at UMass Lowell. And one of the things that I try and, get in and when I'm talking to students and so forth is that marketing kind of encompasses a variety of these different tools. So when we teach marketing, we're teaching about communications, we're teaching about sales, we're teaching about products. So we have all of these things that are kind of broadly subsumed by this term marketing. So we'll be talking a little bit. I know when I'm, going to be, and I have a couple of slides to present up front here. I'm kind of looking at this, and my approach to this communications is looking at the communications within this context of all of marketing, not just the what are we going to put on Facebook approach or anything like that. It is looking at kind of this whole package and where communications fits into that package.
Anything to add, Israel?
Yeah, no, I would agree with Spencer on that. The other thing too that I would add is with social media, right? That sort of has changed the way in which we communicate and in the way in which we do marketing. So I think you can't speak about one without the other now. They all sort of blend together. I would also say now with social media especially, there's a PR and a branding element also that ties in very nicely and one that you must think about. When I was at Constant Contact, one of the terms that we coined was edu-marketing, which was approaching your marketing in an educational way. We now reference it as thought leadership, right? Some people may talk about it that way, but it's this idea that you're selling your product or service in an educational way. So we coined the term edu-marketing to sort of help us understand that.
Okay, great. So yeah, Spencer, you mentioned you had some slides here and you gathered together some of your thoughts about this concept after having looked at the survey data and discussing it a little bit. So why don't you take us through?
So if we want to go to the next slide, I don't have the clicker here. So one of the things I think that we think about when we're talking about recession, and we'll kind of get into this and both the recession and what's going on more broadly in the macro environment, is the idea that marketing shouldn't matter, that marketing gets cut. We see a lot of research in academic literature about marketing being one of the first, business functions to be cut economically when the bottom line starts to drop and so forth. And, there's kind of, I think, this knee-jerk reaction to doing that because we are questioning whether or not marketing actually has an effect. And in fact, we all know as and I know that some of this is self-preservation, but we all know in academia that in fact there are financial benefits, multiple financial benefits around marketing's goals. And again, when I'm saying marketing here, I'm talking bigger picture marketing. But that includes communications, because that's the part of marketing that I think marketing and sales are the two things that I think most people top of mind think of what they have to do when they are marketing. So you see here two cartoons that in the first cartoon talking about how all we're going to do is cut our marketing budget, and so that's the panacea if there's something wrong. And the second one is reflective of the idea that we're going to need to go digital, and what does that mean? And there's been some backlash about the role of technology and what technology can and what technology can't do, and is it truly a panacea for every business problem? And it likely is not. I tend to personally take a more holistic look at approaches to doing strategy and so on. And so even technology by itself is not going to be the only approach here. But both of these, I think, are two myths that we're generally operating on and will be probably operating on as the environment continues. Okay, next one. So the reality, though, is that the research consistently is demonstrating that counter-cyclical investments in marketing are important. What do we mean by counter-cyclical investments? It means that if there is money to be spent, and hopefully there is money to be spent, or part of the budget that your business otherwise has can be spent on marketing, that you will be spending some of that money on that. There are a couple of papers that I've found, in the research where they talk about the positive effects of recession investments in marketing, ranging from advertising and seeing declines in sales when ad budgets drop out, seeing innovation where there are elements of, if you're innovating during the recession, those trends that occur during the recession will carry on long beyond that. And the same thing with customer service. If you're able to retain your customers during the recession, during economic downturn, then it means that you won't have to spend that money chasing them down later down the line, which again is a cost savings long term. And a lot of this is looking at it long term, which can be very difficult to do in a day-to-day basis, right? You're trying to fight battles, but look at the war as a whole. There's another, paper that looks at the trajectory of investments, and if you can invest during these downturns, not only will you be more successful during the downturn, but it will actually put you on a more upward trajectory financially later on when you come out of it. So again, these counter-cyclical investments are important to businesses' sustainability, and that doesn't matter whether you're a large business or a small business. If we'll put the next slide, I think we have an understanding that these larger companies are clearly going to be making these investments, and they're already starting to make them. The tweet that I have here kind of is a stream from Starbucks, and they're talking today or a couple days ago about a $10 million global relief fund for their partners. So obviously there's going to be a lot of money that these companies are going to be able to invest in these and make these counter-cyclical investments. Next slide. The reality is for smaller businesses, and I think many of the people, in the cafe and roastery and retailing kind of industry are looking at, is that there's actually fewer days of cash reserves. 25% of small businesses have fewer than 13 cash buffer days. And on the next bullet point it says that, coffee people are, people in the coffee industry are probably looking at even less than that. And in fact, many of them are maybe fortunate enough right now where their PPP loans are coming through and they're actually able to get some of that money to be able to maintain staff and to be able to keep, going and not have to worry as much as they were without the additional loans. Okay, next, and then next. There are also some considerations from the consumer side that we need to be conscious of. There's a little meme here that's been going around about the relative importance of all these different things, and clearly, doing Zooms and sweatpants and all that other kind of stuff has increased as we've been going on here. But you see kind of the cultural zeitgeist showing that coffee is still important. Coffee is still important. And that is important because during the recession, you're going to see that people are making decisions about what is essential, what is expendable in a completely different type of way. Their mentality kind of adjusts, and therefore it is normal for people to start thinking, well, of all these things, coffee is still something I need. And so they're going to be thinking in that mentality, and there's also going to be this mentality of what happens after we go back. What happens with all the physical distance stuff, and what are shops going to do? Are they going to be open? I've seen things, what's the first thing you'd like to do with a friend after, this quarantine and stay at home is over? And a lot of them are looking to maybe go back to their cafes. I know I am. I'm looking forward to going back to the shop and be able to see some of the baristas at the shop that I usually go to. Next slide. So yeah, okay. Specialty coffee, as I see it, as somebody who's been kind of following specialty coffee and kind of been an enthusiast for, the better part of almost a decade now, is that it actually has a lot of relationships that bigger businesses like Starbucks and Dunkin' Donuts do not necessarily have. They have a lot of brand relationships, but they are kind of missing a few of or quite a bit of the interpersonal relationships that people get acclimated to, having a local shop, having a local cafe, having a roaster that they have this relationship habitually that they buy from, that they brew at home. And that goes kind of back to the ethos of specialty coffee, going to track from kind of a seed to cup sort of approach. The idea that people are very interested, particularly in the specialty coffee business industry, with understanding the value chain. And the fact that the value chain, understanding where the role of farmers is, where the role of baristas is not necessarily perfect. And I know that those conversations are also ongoing in the industry, but also the fact that it allows that kind of it allows for a greater personal relationship between everybody in the value chain. Sorry. Next bullet. So we see these relationships and loyalty in particular built on both customer and employee commitments to the value chain. So we see from the consumer side that they're committed to helping local businesses. They're committed to helping the roasters and the cafes that they frequent, all the time, because they know those people. They know that they're small business owners. They have these, commonalities with them. We also see that with respect to the employees as well. They know the employees, and there's a commitment, in some part, for people to help out the baristas and other employees within the context of both roasteries and cafes. You see that in GoFundMe, which has a list of all the cafes that are looking and soliciting donations for virtual tip jars to help baristas out and so on from the public. Next bullet. Those relationships are also built on engagement with the local community, and there's no time like now, I think, where we see that those community relationships come into play, right? It's not just a corporate sort of feeling. It's not a corporate or a brand type of social responsibility per se. Consumers aren't seeing this as just something, but they're actually recognizing that these shops, these roasters, these cafes are community leaders. And so, with the next bullet point, there is a lot of success that the specialty coffee industry recognizes built around those relationships. And so as a result, communication becomes important to maintain, to foster and to maintain those relationships, both with customers, employees, and the community as a whole. Next slide. So customers, right? Everybody is now saying, we're here, right? We're ready. We're home. We still need our coffee. We want, and a lot of shops kind of have said, okay, well, there's kind of a very abrupt, here's the stay-at-home order, and we're in, and then it was kind of relaxed around what can we actually do, and maybe we can do things with still maintaining physical distancing, and now we can actually get coffee to our customers. And so you see kind of a large volume of brew guides, especially on Instagram, right? There are a ton of brew guides on Instagram. And so, customers are kind of responding to that and saying, okay, well, here we're being communicated with. Next slide. So I actually had seen on Sprudge today, there was a barista survey that was put out with 250 responses. And you can see here that a large part, more than half of the cafes are temporarily closed, which, is maybe, a good thing, well, hopefully a good thing, that it's only temporary. That's not necessarily comforting to everybody. And the same thing, I think it was talking about what the responses were from baristas of, towards the government and towards their employers. And, I was a little bit surprised, I suppose, to see that the unsatisfied piece of the pie was as large as it was. But I think most people are realizing that this is an abnormal situation, and everybody is otherwise trying to kind of get by, trying to triage what they can do. And so part of that, I think, really is the role of communication. Next slide. So as Peter said, right, the survey came out, and there was, these kind of numbers stuck out when I looked at the survey, that 57% are increasing their digital marketing efforts, that 37, we're talking about emailing about COVID-19, 37% moving, in person to virtual. And I'm looking at these numbers, and they're starting to go down. And I'm saying to myself, as somebody looking at the industry as a whole, these numbers should be going up in a time of crisis in that community, because there are things that actually communicate to customers what roasters, what cafes are actually doing, and how they can help the community, their employees, and the customers. Next one. So we've talked about the relationships. Customer relationships build customer trust, which builds customer loyalty. This is something that's repeatedly found in academic research and marketing. And everybody right now is in the same boat. We all know that, the job market is not that great, that unemployment is daunting, that, the economy as a whole is daunting. So the idea of maintaining these relationships becomes critical. So how do you do this? The next slide. Stakeholder-centric communication. I think that's one of the biggest things, and I know Israel's going to talk about some of that from the strategy side in a minute. Next slide. when we look at what the survey said, there are a lot of different strategies that were found. We'll go one. I've got a couple of things. So the first one is that we see online marketing and social media as being top of line, and those are the things that I think that are most that the people that are finding most effect or having the best effect are seeing. The next one. What we're seeing a little bit less of is people talking about shipping and retail and delivery and online sales, and that they're doing takeaway or take it to go or whatever. And those are things, again, that you talked about. You asked in the beginning of this, Peter, the difference between marketing and communications. Those are marketing functions, but those are generally not the things that, at least I'm kind of observing as both a marketing professor, as a consumer researcher, and as a specialty coffee enthusiast. Those are things that I'm not seeing communicated to customers or other stakeholders with great efficiency or great volume. Next slide. So given the constraints of small and medium-sized businesses like roasteries and cafes and so on, how do you communicate? What can you communicate in your value chain relationship? And as I see it, the two big things are maintaining high stakeholder engagement and maintaining high stakeholder transparency. One of the things is showing what you're doing and engaging with both your employees and engaging with your customers, engaging with the community on what you are doing, and not just promoting it on Instagram, which I know the coffee industry is very fond of because it is a very aesthetically photo-friendly type of industry. But when you're looking at customers, all of your customers, and looking at where they're getting their information from. And oftentimes that information is beyond just Instagram. You know, I was looking for some examples I'll show on the next slide, and there are a lot of companies that are kind of on Instagram but not really putting their stuff, haven't updated a Facebook page or a Twitter stream in 2-3 years. And in a time of crisis, people are checking various forms of communication at various platforms, both the website, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Snapchat, whatever. And they want to figure out where they don't want to have to go in all these different places to get that information. So I see a couple of ways that I've kind of liked, a couple of social media communications that I've seen, just kind of picking out. One was George Howell Coffee. They had put out kind of a behind the scenes. They've been kind of answering questions, kind of brand centric. And I'm not saying this is their only strategy or any of these companies' only strategy, but just kind of a pick of kind of some specific things that I've seen. The next one was Roast House out in Spokane, Washington. They're showing how you can support their drive-through efforts by putting in their phone number, so giving an alternate form of communication, even though you could ostensibly DM them or so forth in Instagram. The next one is Black and White Roasters in North Carolina. They're showing how they're engaging the community, that they've got a $250 tab started with the medical hospital to donate coffee. And then the last one, which was looking at how to strategically pivot and communicate those rapid strategic pivots. This is a Source Coffee House down in Southern Connecticut, and they've kind of been one of those shops that have moved towards making a pantry available of things that they get from wholesalers that they can otherwise offer their customers. And again, re-engaging the community in different ways. And one thing I note with that one is that not only did they post this on Instagram, but they also posted it on Facebook. So people otherwise are able to see, if they're not on Instagram, what the company is doing on Facebook. So all these types of things, I think, are things that we see that help build that relationship, that help strengthen that relationship, and help kind of propel the relationship forward between roasters, cafes, and so on, not just in this time of crisis, but moving forward through the time of crisis and into the, into hopefully, some sort of recovery beyond there. So I've got, just an end, but other than that, it would be up to, Israel. So.
Thank you, Spencer. Appreciate that. And I love how you drew together this idea that how important it is to keep marketing through this time, and especially for specialty coffee that's built on relationships. This is the moment that we come to depend on brands, and especially these high-end brands like specialty that really differentiates itself on value and relationship. now's the time to really be there for people who are you built this trust relationship with. So it's a really awesome point that I'd love to dive in more with you.
Absolutely.
That's awesome. So next up, Israel, you've had a long experience in digital communications, and you have some slides to share with us kind of about some tips on your tone, and then also some examples from the industry outside of coffee. So take it away, Israel.
Thank you so much, Scott and Peter, for having me. It's great to be here, and great that you guys are offering this this service and this opportunity for businesses to learn, in some cases, new skills. So just to kind of give you some additional background from my perspective and where I come from. So I actually find myself in the loyalty space right now. So, hearing a lot about how the respondents are focusing on customer loyalty and customer retention makes me feel good about that, because their mind is in the right place. I think now more than ever, making sure that your existing customers are taken care of is key. I know that we are pushing our own clients to focus on that. Typically, our services would be used for a customer acquisition tool, but we're saying as a best practice, this is a good opportunity for you to expand on your loyalty program to make sure that your database of loyal customers are taken care of. So prior to entering the loyalty space, I worked for a SBA-funded organization that's called the Small Business Development Center. This was back in 2008, which was a pretty interesting time then, because it was in the middle of the recession, which I will talk a little bit more about and kind of correlate with what we're seeing now between then and now. And then also, I worked specifically with email marketing platforms with Constant Contact and ListTrack. So a lot of my background in digital, and being that email is one of the original forms of social media, I gravitate more towards email marketing when I do presentations, because that's where I focused a lot of my career on, but I can certainly speak to more about social media as well. So with that, if we can move on to the next slide, please. If you can click, I did a transition slide, so there we go. So in general, what I want to kind of kick off by saying is that even us communication experts are learning during this time, right? So I think that what we're going to find when we are able to surpass this time period is that many of us are going to walk out of this having learned a lot of lessons, but also in many cases, like businesses, for example, will walk away having learned new skills, right? What I'm finding is that a lot of businesses, like Spencer mentioned, are having to sort of hone in on all of their communication tools and trying to figure out what's going to work best, right? So I think that from my perspective, there's two things that I wanted to highlight from this slide. One is the ability to respond to the change in the market context. So what I want to say about that, and Peter and I talked a little bit about this prior to the webinar, is that one of the things that small businesses have to realize, and one of the things that I've always said, is that as a small business, you have an advantage over the larger companies because you can move quicker, right? You have the ability to be able to approve things and move things a lot faster than a bigger corporation, right? So the advantage to that is that you could try and test things out small and be able to move on faster if they don't work. So I think the message here for businesses is that they need to be able to sort of take ownership of the messaging and be able to use that power to be able to communicate with their customers. And then the last bullet, which I think is an important one, is, I think that in these times it is, we find ourselves wanting to maybe over communicate, and I think that that's okay. I think for small businesses, traditionally, I would advise a small business owner to not over communicate, like through, say, like an email marketing campaign, right? I think that because of the situation that we're in and how quickly things are changing, we're left with no other option but to over communicate, right? So I have some examples of that in the next slide. So in terms of just, sorry, if you can go back, I'm sorry. So just in terms of best practices, what I wanted to say here is when we talk about stakeholders, and Spencer, you kind of referenced this, I want to make sure that we understand who and what that means. So for businesses, it's going to be first and foremost your staff and making sure that you have a collective message, right? So I think we're all looking to our leadership for that message, right? How are we going to go to market? What are we going to communicate? What can and can we not say? So I think to start, making sure that you and your team are well aligned with what is going to be communicated is key. And then you can then turn to your customers, right? Like, what are we going to communicate? And then in some cases, what am I going to communicate to my landlord? What am I going to communicate to our investors? So when I talk about stakeholders, I'm talking about all of those people, okay? So next slide, please. So to start, I think, it goes without saying that we have to be sensitive, right? But most importantly, I think that, Spencer, you kind of referenced this as well, is I think people are just wanting to make sure that you're authentic. And I think we're gonna be able to tell if your messaging, if you're coming with a messaging that's very salesy or perhaps very insensitive, people are going to identify that real quick, and it's going to leave a really bad taste in their mouth. So I think the best thing you can do is be authentic and be transparent about what your situation is. I think that because of the situation we are in, people are going to be a little bit more open to hearing that, right? And I think they're going to really appreciate that. Next slide, please. So I think this is a really important thing because I've seen, and we've all seen, right, how our inbox has been inundated with the COVID-19 messaging, right? And I think that I'll share from my perspective because I do help my partner who's an antique dealer. I do run his communication. So I run his email, his social media, things like that. And what I found is that by not addressing it, or by not addressing your customers, it was not going to allow us to continue with our regular communication schedule. And so we felt that it was going to be very important to reference it, and in this case, mention to our customers how we were going to be a resource to them, right? So in the case of my partner, he sells antiques. People want to see them, right? They want to come in and feel the product. So we had to make sure we communicated our hours, our sanitary regiment, things like that. But what I think is also happening is, and Spencer, you kind of pointed it out with when you were saying that the email volume was going down, that people were, you were noticing that it was going down. I think what could happen, or what's happening here with small businesses, is that because their own inbox is being inundated with messaging, I think that a lot of them feel paralyzed by the fact that, am I going to be just another business sending out a similar email? And I think that we have to get over that fear, because not communicating is not an option. And what I mean by that is not communicating, or at least addressing it, won't allow you to carry on with business. So as scary as it may seem, I think oftentimes it may just be with not finding the right messaging, right, or what to say. I think that, done is better than perfect in this case. Next slide. And then, so with this slide, what I want to just kind of, make sure that I mention is, I could technically sit here and give you a list of the variety of tools that are out there, and we know there are many. But what I want the key message to be here is that there are a lot of tools, and some tools are going to work for you and some are not, right? And so, as Spencer mentioned earlier, I think that what's important with this is that you make sure you understand where your audience is and focus on those communication tools first, right? So if the majority of your people are in your email inbox or your subscriber list, focus on that. If you are going to be, if you have a big following on Instagram, of course you're going to want to communicate there, right? What I think is so interesting about the situation we're in now is that when I compare it back to 2008, right? This is when I was working at the Small Business Development Center. It was interesting because back then we were having small business owners come in telling us, I'm trying to update my website, but I can't get a hold of my developer, right? Or my developer is not giving me the password because I owe him money. And so a lot of these businesses were sort of locked in, right? Or didn't have the opportunity to update their own website. We find ourselves in a different time, right? Where a lot of people now do have control over their website, right? Have the ability to put up a messaging on their website about how they're handling this, right? They have social media platforms, they've got an email platform. So I think that, when you compare the situation in 2008 to now, is we've got the tools and we have to make sure that we're using them appropriately. So next slide, please. I came across this message here, and I thought it was really important just to share, because it sort of hopefully allows and it frees some of these businesses to continue with their marketing. Because the reality is, as somebody that is a small business supporter, I do want to make sure that the businesses that I love are able to succeed through this. And so I am going to be a little bit more lenient about how you communicate with me this time around. I'll tell you that one of my favorite coffee shops, I've been very closely following their messaging, because I'm not only a fan of their coffee, but I'm also a fan of their marketing and their branding in general. But what I found that is, in the last month, I've received 20 emails from them. Okay, so it's interesting, because those 20 normally, as a best practice, I would be like, wow, that's a little bit like overly done, right? You're over communicating. But given the circumstances, right, when you look at the messaging and what the content of what those emails were, it really sort of allows these businesses to get away with it. Because in one of those emails, for example, they were communicating their hours. In another one, they were communicating the fact that they now had to close and had to, they were only by delivery. So email was actually a good tool for them to communicate. So I'm not docking them for the number of emails that they're sending, because I actually want to hear this. I actually want to know what they're doing. The other thing too that I would say is, especially with all of those emails that came in originally about COVID-19, I've always said this to small businesses is, the fact that you landed in their inbox is already a good sign. You're already sort of making an impression. Now, truthfully, while I probably didn't open that email initially, I did go back to it a couple weeks later, because I thought, wait, what are their hours? Are they completely closed? What are they doing? So I did go back to those emails eventually. So just a note for small businesses there. Next slide, please. So I actually came across this story this morning, so I added this slide last minute, and I thought it was a pretty good feel-good story. So I find myself in the tech space right now, and we have a lot of partnerships with just different tech platforms. So this actually is a story from a colleague of mine who is in Canada, came across this sign at his favorite coffee shop, and he felt compelled to reach out to this small business owner, because as somebody that is in tech or has been in tech for this long, we take for granted how easy it is for us to, in some cases, develop a website if that's what's needed. But we still have to remember that there's businesses out there that don't have those tools yet. So what he did is he reached out to this business owner, and basically within a matter of 10 days, launched a website. If you can click, please. I want to show you guys what the end result was. So he pulled through, he called a bunch of his tech partners, called Shopify, and he said, listen, this is what I want to do. I want to build a website for businesses, cafes, and roasters that don't have an online presence, and I want to help them sell their product online. So this is just an example of how businesses are sort of rallying together to make sure that businesses succeed. So I thought this was a really powerful story and something to share with you guys. Next slide, please. And I talked a little bit about this with customer retention. I won't go into too much detail other than, as a small business owner, you're finding yourself now having to communicate with your customers remotely, right? So I think that customer engagement is super critical at this time. I would encourage you to leverage this time to hone in on user-generated content. So being able to reach out to your customer base and ask them for reviews, or ask them to share their experience of your cafe, so that way you have content to be able to reshare with others. Next slide, please. So with this, I'll preface it by saying that, from somebody that works with mid-sized to enterprise businesses, I'm seeing a lot of ways in which these businesses are reacting to COVID-19. These are just some ways that I think we can learn from, right? So if you go to the next slide, please. This is Chiquita Banana. We're all familiar with Chiquita Banana, right? I thought it was interesting because what they did is they found a way to acknowledge the circumstances in a way that was, I thought, very creative. Having spent time in the coffee community, I know how creative the specialty coffee community is. So if you click on the next slide, this is how they responded to the answer. So they actually took out Miss Chiquita from the label and posted a message that says, "I'm already home." So this was their response to promoting social distancing. So this is just one example, or maybe you can take inspiration from this if you haven't already addressed it. Think creatively. It doesn't have to be a press release. It doesn't have to be a long story. It doesn't have to be anything. It has to make sense for your brand. And if you feel like you can pull something off like this, then you should, right? Next slide, please. So this is Mercado Libre. This is a tech platform. Traditionally, their logo is two hands shaking. This is how they responded to COVID-19. If you can click. So it's creative, it's easy, it's fun, right? It doesn't have to be this big hoopla. And I love that. I love the simplicity of it. Next slide, please. This is actually, for those brands that are continuing to want to generate sales, right? And be sensitive and acknowledge it. This is actually a brand that is doing a unique promo offer. If you click on the next slide, for one day, they were calling it pay what you can. And essentially is, if you were going to shop for shoes and willing to pay full price, they would match it by donating a pair of shoes to a local organization, right? They also said, if you want to give yourself 25% off, there's an opportunity there, up to 40%. This is what this means for us. So it was a way for them to be transparent. They said, look, we can give them to you at 40% off because that's what we need to help us keep the lights on. So it's, I thought it was very interesting and a unique promo. Next slide, please. So what I will say about this particular slide is, and I referenced it a little bit earlier, and I think this is where communication, social media, marketing, and PR sort of all tie into one, right? As we know, the toilet paper industry found themselves in a very interesting predicament, right, with all of this, right? So how do you handle something that's in many ways, impacting people, in some ways, making people angry, making people fearful, right? So I think that this is a good opportunity for us to learn from what Cottonelle did. And so how they responded to all this, if you click on the next, please, Scott, is they started an initiative. They partnered with United Way. They said, look, we're gonna pledge, $1 million to United Way to make sure that, people who are being affected by this get some help. They're also donating toilet paper to United Way. So this is, I don't wanna, the messaging here isn't that you have to give away $1 million. This is not what this is. It's making sure that as a business, you're paying attention to what the community needs. And if there is a way for you to participate and help, you should and you can, right? It's gonna go a long way. So next slide, please. These are just some final thoughts before I pass it back to Peter and Scott. So remember, your first response won't be your last. We're all sort of learning from this, right? Next bullet, lean into what you do know, right? Go find your audience, focus on that. Think about all of your stakeholders, but prioritize your employees. And then last but not least, you will have the ability to respond rapidly now and be able to respond to the market changes. So take ownership of that. And yeah, I wish you guys all, all success.
Great. Thank you, Israel. That was really great and helped us form some tangible activities here. So I'd like to encourage anybody in the webinar to go ahead and contribute some questions if anyone has some questions. I'll start. One of the things that jumped out at me, Spencer, in your presentation, is you talked about the importance of investing during difficult times and how that can be extra valuable. But of course, I'm sure you were thinking about it. I was thinking about while listening to that, how difficult and how scary that is, you know, and how impossible it is for businesses that they don't have anything to invest right now. So I'd love to hear some thoughts. I know you guys have shared some already, but what individuals and businesses can do in this space when they don't have actual money to invest, but how they can invest the resources of time and energy that it takes to be good communicators at this time. Any thoughts about that?
Well, I think that's definitely a good question, and certainly relevant to, you know, we were saying, you know, the larger companies, larger brands are going to have more of that money to invest in, you know, are going to have, you know, some of that capital in to be able to do things with. I think that it's kind of a little bit also of what Israel was saying as well, that first of all, there are businesses out there that work with small businesses, and, you know, some of them may be a little bit more lenient at this time in helping small businesses, local businesses be able to get off the ground. You know, there are, just as we're doing now, there are a lot of webinars with everybody being at home, and I know not everybody's going to be able to get home. So obviously, like we're doing with this, a lot of them are usually available for later. So there's kind of almost becoming a little bit of a glut of some of the resources out there right now that are available for small business owners. And oftentimes we're kind of doing these things with a kind of a broader business eye and maybe thinking about them a little bit from a larger business perspective and a bigger brand perspective. But there's no reason, I think, you know, other than, you know, the size and capital, that some of these lessons and takeaways aren't applicable to small businesses. I think certainly they are applicable to small businesses. I think that by using those, in fact, you may kind of then have the leg up on that and be able to take advantage of the fact that there are free resources available, not just for large businesses, but for small businesses that you can now leverage in your you know, during the, you know, the economic downturn and the recovery to become, you know, to help later on. So I think that even though there are some things that are certainly capital intensive, labor obviously is, you know, one of those things. You know, investing in the labor is a tough, you know, investing in some of the, you know, you're not going to be running television spots like, you know, Starbucks might throw a TV spot on, you know, and saying, you know, that we just launched, you know, a $10 million, you know, global fund, but you may be able to take advantage not just of the resources that are out there by these companies, but some of the free platforms that are out. And maybe it's just, you know, adding to the traditional mix that you're already using, but like Israel said, boosting what you're doing and getting the, you know, the message. I mean, when I'm talking about relationships, you know, and relationship building, I think we don't think, and a lot of people don't take the time to think about the relationships we have as normal human relationships, right? Brands and companies are, you know, even though we're looking at them as kind of amorphous, they evolve and they maintain and they strengthen and they help each other and they support each other through communication. And I don't think that that's any different, and you don't treat it any different, you know, despite maybe the lack of being able to throw advertising money at it or, you know, whatever else. It's just communication is bare bones, and I think, yeah.
I love your answer, Spencer, and I think it kind of goes back almost to the original question that we posed, which is what's the difference between marketing and communication? In many ways, like communication is free because we have these resources where we're already talking to our existing customers or stakeholders, and we have a digital platform to be able to do that. And marketing almost starts bending us into this area where we're doing paid ads versus something that's organic. And so in this moment, like leaning into communication to the people that are already our advocates and our fans is like you know, obviously the way that we should be going right now when there's not budget for marketing or advertising. So kind of diving into that discussion a little bit more. And like Israel, I think this is interesting too for you, which would be thinking about the stakeholders. I love that you brought that up. And we've been talking a lot here about external communication to customers and how to keep customer loyalty and retention. But a huge issue right now is all of our employees at our small coffee businesses. How are we communicating to our baristas and to our managers and to our employees, and how are they feeling safe? And could you talk just a little bit about maybe the differences in the way that we communicate with our internal stakeholders versus the external customer?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think, you know, I've talked to a lot of my colleagues about, you know, what do we think, what can we identify as of now, like maybe one of the tools or one of the key takeaways that we're all going to walk away from. And it keeps coming back to that, you know, how are we communicating with our internal staff first? And it's interesting because even something so simple as to what we're doing right now, for us, jumping on this webinar, no big deal, right? Launching a webinar for some of us is not as scary as it is for, you know, an owner of a cafe that, you know, needs to find his way or their way to host a company meeting remotely, right? I mean, something so simple as this could be, you know, so difficult for some, right? So, you know, what I think is so interesting from all of this is video and one-on-one, right? So just even the fact that you could jump on a webinar and see your employees makes such a big difference than to have everybody join a conference call. Does that make sense?
It does. Totally makes sense.
And I think one thing, if I can kind of take, you know, even some of the things that I've seen, you know, following, like I said, and I didn't want to put down people's Instagram strategies because certainly I know that I'm on it enough too. But I think one of the things that, you know, that Instagram that I've seen, particularly from employees and so forth, is there's a lot of camaraderie that's going on between each other's, you know, stories and tagging each other in stories and so on that occurs naturally. And just, it's kind of, I'm seeing it amplified. I'm seeing barista Zooms and things of that nature. And it's kind of like, okay, well, maybe not everybody has that kind of specific relationship with, you know, their employer or so forth, but having those kinds of things, in fact, now may be the time to bring that kind of family element together to strengthen that relationship, in fact. And so it seems kind of like ridiculous that you might be having that, but, you know, employee Slack channels are going to be great and they'll be helpful and you can communicate quickly and, you know, that'll be nice. But doing those things kind of maybe from a creative angle, I've seen places showcasing the baristas off hours work where they'll do artwork or they'll do poetry or they'll do whatever. And it's not, and they normally wouldn't, you know, be talking about what the baristas are doing on an extensive basis, but they're trying to engage their employees, you know, as part of the communication process. And like you said, you know, Israel, I think like giving the employees maybe control a little, or, you know, ceding some control of communications and letting them know, you know, customers have that sense of what their employees are doing and reaching out that way, you know, and brings the employees together, I think, as well as part of this. Because, you know, we've all, I think, well, many of us have done kind of those we're all in this together type of video. And, you know, we really are. And I think that a lot of the businesses now, you know, particularly small kind of close knit ones, are looking at creating that sense of community, not just within the whole community, but within the company as well.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen, you know, we saw this last week with the Rally for Coffee, right? I mean, that was something that was initiated by an external stakeholder, you know, somebody who, you know, whose business is exclusively to selling to the trade, right? So it's like, that's somebody who I feel stepped up, said, look, you know, their survival is my survival, right? And it was done, I think, very tactfully, you know, very tastefully, and it was hopefully a campaign that can keep going, right? So that to me, I think, is a good example as well.
One, I just want to emphasize one part of what we were just talking about. Last week's webinar, we talked to two cafe owners that were talking about, you know, how they modified their service. And both of them talked about how they got their staff together and they came to a decision about how they were going to move forward together. And that's like next level communication. It's group decision making and stuff. And that's an advantage that a small business has that a large business just can't have.
Right.
is actually that level of engagement. I think what you just said, Israel, about turning over some of the control to your larger community during these times. I think it's that can really benefit. So we've got a couple questions I want to get to from the community. Here we have a question. I'll just read it. Through this time, I want to rethink my customer identity to one of supporting specialty coffee. Do you think that in the future we will look to build relationships with coffee shops that are more long-term than the daily transaction of buying coffee?
I think, and this kind of encapsulates what we've been talking about, and my short answer would be yes. I think that, you know, we are already seeing that kind of in this, or, you know, in this extended sense, looking at some of what some of the shops are doing, looking at what some of the roasters and cafes are doing. You know, you're already looking at that and saying they're trying to show and demonstrate through some of the communications they've done what exactly the type of relationship they want to have. They're showing that they're, and you said that, you know, the 20 emails, you know, that you're getting from, you know, the particular shop, and, you know, and it is, and in a normal time, it would be excessive volume, but they're showing that they're bending over backwards to get that information out to consumer to get that relationship strengthened. And I think that that's one of the things, as somebody who's been an enthusiast of specialty coffee for so many years and been, you know, in academia for several years, you know, doing research on consumers, is looking at that kind of, and wanting to look at this kind of together, is the relationship between specialty coffee consumers with the roasters and cafes, not just the farmers as well. Last year, a year or so, a little over a year and a half ago, I was in Australia for a couple of weeks in Brisbane, and one of the things I noticed was how radically different the coffee scene there was. And part of the reason that the coffee scene was different was just the dynamic of the market. Part of the reason the market was so dynamic, and I think we kind of know that as a case study in the, you know, in the industry, was that the relationship between the consumer and their local shop is radically different. I went to like 16 different coffee shops while I was down there, and what I found interesting was that each one of them kind of had their own customer base, even though they were located, you know, 3 shops on the same street. It was a very different kind of feel, and I think that perhaps this is the kind of thing, I don't know entirely that we're going to get there, but this is the kind of thing, and as I saw this, the growth in the specialty coffee industry, I think, happened a lot out of the 2008-2009 recession, when people were looking to something else, and they were kind of seeing that community and that relationship evolving in specialty coffee. I don't have any data on this one to back up, but I would bet, I would make an inference that there was a correlation between the recession and that kind of spike as 2008-2009 occurred within the rise of specialty coffee. Yeah. And that, I think, has something to do with the relationship building.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say there's no doubt that we're going to walk out of this having a different relationship with our customers. I also feel like we're not going to walk out of this without something, with a shift in how we communicate. And, you know, I'll reference it back to 2008, when I was trying to convince my own employer about, you know, posting on Facebook, right? Like, they didn't see a value in that, right? It was like, and that back then was like, you know, unique. It was like, what are you doing? So I feel like we just got to, you know, keep our eye and our ears open, right? And see what's happening and learn as we go.
I mean, think about even just the retailing perspective. You know, there's been shops that I've seen lately that have been switching up to 5-pound bags of their wholesaler size coffee and offering that to consumers. I mean, if that says kind of, and I know that's not a perfect example, but, you know, if that says nothing about the relationship that they're looking for, is that not only are you going to buy a pound of coffee, but you're going to go all in on a 5-pounder, you know, that then you're looking to say, I'm going to be, you know, I need your coffee for a month. And that's the relationship I'm having with you, is having your bag of coffee sticking around for a month. And yeah, I think that's a pivot that you didn't necessarily think in normal times, but now is a service that's being communicated to customers that's beneficial.
Well, yes, and so thank you. I love Israel's last point about really making this a learning time and to keep learning through this time, and as you're saying too. So with that in mind, I really want to appreciate Spencer and Israel, your help in helping us learn some new skills and new perspectives on this kind of communication. So with that, I'd love to, we're at the hour, so I'd like to wrap this up. I'd love to thank both of you, and also Scott, thank you very much for your participation here. And finally, thanks to La Marzocco for sponsoring this webinar series and helping us do that education during this really dynamic time.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Israel and Spencer.
Thank you for having us.
Really appreciate you joining us all, and to everyone out there in the industry. I just hope you're doing really well, and hope you have a great rest of your week too.
Thanks, everyone. Join us for our next webinar series that we'll be announcing through our communications channels. Okay. Bye,
Thanks,
everyone.
Bye.